record this? Because why not? Actually, so just so you should know, so a couple of things and then we'll get started. If you wanted to review the lecture that we did last Tuesday, you could actually go to AP Government Review Lectures, and here's a copy of what we did. I cut out all the nonsense, of course. I edited it, and you got a 1 hour review video basically here. So pretty cool. So in any case, let's get right to it. And everything is really on the Word document. So we're going to continue on. We basically got to do like about 10 pages in about 44 minutes or something like that. I think we can handle it. So here we go. So very briefly, how a bill becomes a law. I'm not going to go through it step by step, but you can look at the steps that are on the document. Basically, step one, the bill starts out as an idea. Step two, usually it's either introduced by a congressman or a senator. Every bill has to have a title, like if it comes from the House, it's H.R. 1. If it's from the Senate, it's S1. And they always start out with the number 1 for when they have the new session of House or Senate. In other words, when Pelosi took over, H.R. 1, H.R. 2, H.R. 3. When they have the next session of House after the 2020 election, again, H.R. 1, S1, et cetera, et cetera. So after the bill is introduced, they send it to committees, and then the committees review. First, it has to go through the committee. If the committee thinks the bill is a weak bill, it doesn't even go to the full Senate or the full House. So it has to get through the committee. Sometimes it goes to the committee without changes. Sometimes they have changes. Sometimes they say they're going to replace the bill with a better bill. And sometimes they say the bill should die. The bill is killed. Okay? Once the bill reaches the floor of the House or Senate, was the full House, then they vote the pros and the cons. Sometimes the Senate adds riders. That's like where they put in their pork barrel because they want to get some money for their people. And if the Senate tries to filibuster it, that can prevent it. We all know the longest filibuster was by Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, who spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes because he was against the Civil Rights Bill. Then they vote for it, assuming there's enough of a vote. Then the president has some choices. The president can sign the bill. The president could veto the bill. If the president vetoes the bill, you can override the veto with 2/3 of Congress. The president can also do nothing. He could sit on the bill, and then it's like he vetoed it. So it's like a little bit of a sneaky thing to do. And if Congress is in session and the president approves it, it automatically passes. And so that's that. And again, these are the 8 big ideas on how it goes. It goes from idea, it's introduced, it goes to committee, subcommittee, another committee, full House or Senate, because both the House and Senate have to approve it, and then presidential action. Okay? So moving along, gerrymandering. They like to ask questions about gerrymandering. If you remember, gerrymandering is when they carve up the district into funny positions so that they could get more votes. So in other words, a lot of times a Republican will try to create an easy Republican district to win. So like they'll bunch all the Democrats into one district rather than having Democrats spread across 3 districts, because then it makes it a harder vote. So they try to say, okay, this district will be definitely Democrat, but let's make these other 3 Republican, okay? And the gerrymandering is very controversial because it's sort of like not playing fair, basically, if you think about it. And there's been a lot of cases about that. There was the case of Baker versus Carr, where they were talking about whether they were portioning out the votes correctly and so forth. And so they basically asked the question, does the Supreme Court have the right to intervene? And basically they said, because of the 14th Amendment, which says equal protection under the law, if they feel that the equal protection of the law is being violated through gerrymandering, the Supreme Court has the right to intervene. So in other words, before they decide whether it's even whether it's a fair play or foul play, there was even a bigger kasha, if you will. Are they even allowed to review it? Like, in other words, how is the Supreme Court claiming that it's their right to review? So they're saying under the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law gives them the right to review it. Okay. Now, later on in the 1990s, there was another case called Shaw versus Reno. The U.S. Attorney General, who was Janet Reno at the time, rejected the North Carolina Congressional Reinforcement Plan because it created only one black majority district. Then North Carolina submitted another plan saying, okay, we'll have two black majority. We understand the black majority districts are going to be Democratic. And five North Carolina residents challenged the constitutionality of this because they said it was unusually shaped district. And they said this was just, they were actually countersuing, saying that it was a way of getting additional blacks voted into office. So then the question was, did the North Carolina residents claim that the state created a racially gerrymandered? So in other words, in this claim, they were claiming that you were creating black districts, and was that fair? So they said, I mean, was that a fair thing to do? And they said, no, it's not fair. And basically, they basically voted it down. Okay, so sometimes there are different. So usually gerrymandering is done along political lines. In this case, it was done along racial lines. Okay. Now, but then we go to the Constitution. Article Section 1 basically says the president has to be a natural-born citizen, at least 35 years old, had to live in the United States for 14 years. So in other words, think about it like this. Ted Cruz lived in Canada a good part of his life. However, he's a natural-born citizen. He's obviously, in other words, what makes him a natural-born citizen? Because his parents were born in the U.S. So even though they moved out to Canada for a while, he's still a naturally born citizen. And so even though he was not born in America, he was not, he's still a naturally born citizen because his parents were. Okay? Joey?
Let's say if a person's parents are born, like my parents, they're born out of Syria. So that makes me a national Syrian citizen?
Well, right now we're talking about American citizenship. So I'll be very honest with you. I don't know Syrian citizenship laws. So I wouldn't even attempt to ask a question, or answer a question on that. Okay? We're just talking about USA natural born citizens. Isaac, you had a question?
No, I have no question.
You're just stretching. Okay. So
Yeah.
anyhow, no problem. And this issue of natural born citizens comes up all the time. A lot of times people, ask questions. They were asking, well, Ted Cruz wasn't born in America. They claim Barack Obama wasn't born in America, although he was born in Hawaii. They claim John McCain wasn't born in America. Technically, he was born in the Panama Canal, which is a territory, so it's a little bit of a vague kind of thing. But that's where it comes from. You don't have to know all that history. You just have to be aware of what the requirements are to become president. So we know the Electoral College, you must win the majority of electoral votes. And we know that this issue comes up quite a lot. I mean, just in the last 20 years, Trump lost the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College. Bush lost the popular vote, but he won the electoral. And so these issues come up. Last time it came up was in the 1800s, but it's up for us. It's come up twice in the last 20 years. Now, some people talk about this idea of the imperial presidency. Now, what does the word imperial mean? It means that you're like an empire, like a king. Why? Because the president has expanded powers. How do they have expanded powers? Well, they do a State of the Union. They do this big speech. If you think about Trump, he likes to talk a lot, okay? And so it makes him look all powerful. FDR also used the modern media and the TV, the internet, tweeting. These are all examples of why sometimes it seems like the president is all powerful. He is not, but it seems that way. Now, we also know that there was a Succession Act of 1947, which talked about if the president becomes, indisposed, what is the succession? Vice president, Speaker of House, President pro tempore of the Senate, Secretary of State. You just have to be aware of the fact that there's a line of succession of who's first in line, who's second in line, who's third in line, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's an important thing to be aware of, the fact that there are different orders of succession, if you will. 22nd Amendment, we know that's term limits. Basically, a president can only run for 2 terms. That was not true prior to that. 25th Amendment, well, that addresses the presidential vacancy and disability. And like, in other words, what happens if a presidential vacancy arises? Well, that's how they came up with the idea of the vice president. In other words, even though he had a Succession Act of 1947, obviously someone tried to challenge it, so they wrote an amendment saying, okay, president is indisposed, like Richard Nixon, then okay, vice president takes over. By the way, 25th Amendment, not only does it say about, if they throw out the president, how about if the president has a disability where they have to go under heart surgery, or how about if the cabinet of the president determines that the president is mentally unstable? They could actually, in other words, they don't even need to impeach the president. If somebody wants, if half of the cabinet of the president thinks the president is mentally unstable, they can throw him out. Okay, as a matter of fact, the deputy attorney general for Trump believed that he was mentally unstable, and he was actually trying to plan a coup to throw out Trump. I don't know if you guys know that. That's why Trump was very angry and basically fired him, okay? Because it was confirmed that although he was not successful, he was trying to get a number of people to invoke the 25th Amendment to throw Trump out of office, because he really wanted Pence to be president. It's a whole nother story. And so it never actually happened. Usually when they talk about the 25th Amendment on these like TV political dramas, they have this situation where the president, they find out the president murdered someone or whatever it is. Okay, we got to invoke the 25th Amendment, or the president is, so they always talk about this in TV. It actually almost happened under Trump for real. But in the end, it did not happen. Anyhow, so we move along. What are the powers of the president? Powers of the president is they are the chief legislator. They have the power of persuasion through TV. They can veto. Now, there was a thing called line item veto where you could veto one line of a bill. However, there was a Supreme Court case that made the line item veto unconstitutional. So the only president that actually ever used line item veto, by the way, was President Clinton. They gave him the line item veto saying, Mr. President, we want you to line item veto, this was Congress, said line item the parts of the budget you don't like. And which was a great idea, because that way you can cut unnecessary spending out. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court said, no, we don't want to give the president line item veto, so it no longer exists, okay? But that was a Supreme Court case. He's, of course, the commander-in-chief. He does have limits, though, because the War Powers Act lets them only do it up to 60 days. They're the chief diplomat. That's why, Trump, speaks to Russia, North Korea, other countries. Sometimes presidents have executive agreements. Sometimes presidents have executive orders. One of the most famous executive orders was Executive Order 9006, where they put the Japanese in interim camps. And president can also invoke executive privilege to a point. Okay, Avi? Yeah.
Yeah, I heard that. Is it true that we're having a war with North Korea?
A war with North Korea? No.
Because I heard Donald Trump said that he called him short and fat. That's what I heard.
Oh, okay. So, for a hot minute, sometimes Trump likes to open his big mouth, and so he called him a lot of things. He used to call him Little Rocket Man too. But then he made nice with him, and since then he's been pretty nice to him. Joey,
Didn't King Jong-un die?
that
People
was
say
that was a rumor.
it was a rumor,
It was a rumor that was spreading around for about a week.
but it was on the news though.
They basically said either he's dead, or he's really sick, or he's vacationing somewhere. Turns out he's not dead. A lot of people actually believe that he was afraid of COVID-19, so he was hiding out. Anyhow, so we move along. There are also Senate and presidential appointees. Usually, most Senate and presidential appointees go through. Every so often, there's an issue. So, for example, John Towers, who was supposed to be a Supreme Court justice, they voted him down. They said that he's a heavy drinker. He owns stocks and defense contracts. So they voted him down. And as I was saying the other day, Betsy DeVos, a lot of people didn't like her, including some Republicans. She almost didn't get in. It was a 50-50 vote. And basically, Vice President Pence had to break the tiebreaker. All right, so moving along, the federal bureaucracy has over 2.7 million employees. Most people are selected by merit. In the old days, they used to appoint them under Madison. And again, as our government grows, the bureaucracy grows. Sometimes people still get jobs as patronage. That means like, you were loyal to me, so I'm going to reward you. However, bureaucracy increased a lot under the New Deal. When FDR saved the country from going down, he also added a lot of fat to the government, a lot of jobs. I mean, it's good and it's bad. That's why sometimes Republicans will say, we're sick and tired of the big government. Now, by the way, the Great Society, which was under Lyndon Baines Johnson, he also added a lot of things. You know, it was a war against poverty, Medicaid, Medicare, Head Start. And so he also blew up the size of government. Some people also would argue that Obamacare in 2012 also increased the size of government because now the government is in the business of helping people get, health care, okay? And again, as you add more jobs for the government to do, it's going to increase the size of the government. There's no way to get around it. Now, there's no easy answer on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Look, some people say the New Deal is very good because people have unemployment insurance, Social Security. I mean, these are good things. They saved the country from a depression. That's a good thing. Some people say, but the government's spending too much money. Same thing with the Great Society. Some people like it, some people don't like it. Same thing with Obamacare. Although these days, I will say, the majority of things that started under New Deal are very popular till this day. Who does not like the idea of Social Security when they retire? Just like the Great Society, who does not like the idea of Medicaid, Medicare? Just like, ironically, Obamacare, which is not that old, when Obama was president, people didn't really like it. Now that he's not president, it's more popular than ever, and it keeps getting more popular. It's very ironic, but that's kind of the way history works. They usually like people after they're out of office more. Okay, so moving along, Ronald Reagan was a big part of his thing was deregulation. Joey?
Oh, yeah.
What's up?
So I heard that they're putting on the 2020 quarter a fruit bat. Is it true?
I'll defer to your expertise. Hopefully that wasn't on the dark internet. Anyhow, so moving along, deregulation. Ronald Reagan said, I want less rules, less government. This is the beginning of the modern Republicans. By the way, Reagan, Bush 1, Bush 2, and Trump all believe in deregulation. That, what Reagan pushed for, we still do. Pendleton Civil Service Act, that was really a big push that you should get a job because you're qualified, not because somebody likes you, okay? Now, one of the things, though, is even though we have all these great intentions, a lot of times bureaucracies do a lousy job. Why? There's a lack of clarity, a lack of resources, and a lot of times the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's saying, and so a lot of times, like for example, I work for one of the biggest bureaucracies in the world. I work for the New York City Department of Education. And again, for the most part, their intentions are good. But sometimes their own bureaucracies, cause all kinds of problems. I'll give you an example, and I'm going to move on. So first, they were making everybody crazy in the New York City public school system that you're not allowed to use Zoom, okay? That's how they poskined, right? And so teachers got angry and whatever it is. And so then they found that now, yesterday they gave a heter, okay, you can use Zoom again, okay? And so they made everyone crazy for nothing. So sometimes, they create rules that waste a lot of people's time, okay? Again, they were concerned about, internet security, blah, blah, blah. But in the end, they were driving a lot of people up the wall. Luckily, in Yeshiva Orator, you don't have to worry about that. Anyhow, so that's the thing about bureaucracies. And again, there's been a big movement towards deregulation. What does that mean? Deregulate means you're taking away the rules, okay? And that's a big Republican idea. They don't like government restrictions. They say when you have extra rules, it raises the prices, okay? In other words, if I got to keep my materials environmentally sound, that means things are going to cost more. If I don't have to follow all these rules, I can drive down the cost of things. Now, the thing about bureaucracy is a lot of times they want to cut the red tape, but then they wind up creating more rules. And so again, a lot of times bureaucracies are very disorganized, okay? I'll give you another example of a bureaucracy. The DMV, the Driver Motor Vehicles Bureau. Sometimes it feels like, oh boy, okay? Sometimes, though, they are successful. So like with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they had a very clear goal, and they implemented it pretty well. But usually, bureaucracies are not the best thing in the world, okay? So moving along to the judicial branch. We all know that's the Supreme Court. Initially, it was considered the weakest branch in the Constitution. However, as we discussed yesterday, Marbury versus Madison changed that. Marbury versus Madison basically gave them judicial review. It gave them the right to poskin on whether things are constitutional or not, okay? And we have a three-tier system in the courts. In other words, we have 94 U.S. district courts. We have 11 circuit courts and 1 Supreme Court. Because obviously, the Supreme Court can't hear every case. So first, it goes to the lower district courts. If you're not satisfied, you can appeal to the circuit courts. You're still not satisfied, then you go to the Supreme Court, okay? Now, who has the authority to hear cases? So we have different jurisdiction. So exclusive jurisdiction means only the federal court has the right to hear the ruling. Concurrent means that both, the word co, which means both, right? Concurrent, both, both federal and state, okay? Sometimes they talk about original. Who is the first one who has the right to hear the case? Original jurisdiction. Sometimes we have appellate. Now, in the word appellate, you have the word appeal. So the idea is that this court can only hear appeal cases. In other words, if you have a court which is called a court of appeal, the Court of Appeals, they can only hear appeals, okay? Now, U.S. district courts usually have original jurisdiction. The Court of Appeals, which makes sense, has appellate jurisdiction. And Supreme Court, because they're the Supreme Court, they have both. And so the question is, by the way, most cases never reach the Supreme Court. Only a very small percent. So how does a case reach the Supreme Court? So there's this thing called the writ of certiorari. That means if 4 of the 9 justices want to hear the case, they can claim writ of certiorari, and they're going to hear the case, okay? And so what is the trial process of the Supreme Court? So the trial does not function like a traditional trial. There is no evidence presented. Rather, each side presents their arguments for 30 minutes while being questioned by the justice. Once the arguments are over, the justices write their opinions. Now, how come the trial process at the Supreme Court is different? The reason why it's different is because if they had to hear all the evidence, they would never get anything done. So in other words, presumably you already have all the evidence from the lower courts. They're just hearing the appeal, so they want to get right to the point. You present your side, we'll make a decision, okay? Now, then we have majority opinion. So if five or more justices have a decision, that's the majority opinion, and it becomes a precedent. In other words, whatever the judges decide, that will be, they will have to use that information for future cases. Okay? You can't, say, well, I really didn't like what that judge said, so I'm throwing it out and I'm going to come up with a new way. No, you have to follow precedent. Okay? Doesn't make a difference whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, you have to follow precedent. In other words, you have to look how past judges judge, and you can extend your decision around that. So majority opinion is five or more agree with your decision. Dissenting means I disagree. I disagree. So sometimes you have a minority. It could be 3, it could be 4, it could be 2. So there's always a majority opinion and a dissenting opinion. Why do they do that? But that way they have a record of both points of view. And then we have a concurring opinion. Sometimes you agree with what the majority says, but you might have a slightly different way of looking at it. So you want to give an opinion as well. Sometimes you have a judge who says, I have a conflict of interest. I used to work for Citibank, so I can't sit on this case. By the way, you should know, if you're ever a Supreme Court justice or a judge, if there is a case where you believe that you have a vested interest, you have to say, I recuse myself from this case, okay? So for example, Trump's first attorney general, he knew some information about what the Russians did, right? So Attorney General Jeff Sessions said, I recuse myself from the case, and he handed it off to his Deputy Attorney General, Rosen, okay? Because he said, how can I judge a case? How can I make a ruling if I have a conflict of interest? And he's right. You always are supposed to recuse yourself. By the way, when there was an issue with Hillary Clinton, and because it was known that the former Attorney General was good friends with the Clintons, she also said, Attorney General Lynch said, I recuse myself because everybody knows that I love the Clintons. It would not be fair. And she's right. You have to recuse yourself when you have a vested interest. The rule of law is very, very important. All right. So then we have these, what we call very popular Supreme Court cases. Of course, Marbury versus Madison, we know for the 100th time, it established judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland, very important because this is how Congress can use the elastic clause under the necessary and proper clause. That's how they got the right to tax. Gibson versus Ogden was about regulating interstate commerce. Dred Scott versus Sanford, very, very controversial. They basically said that people that were African American are not considered citizens, period. Obviously that was changed, but at the time was very controversial. Plessy versus Ferguson said segregation was constitutional as long as both races had equal facilities. And what they call that, by the way, they call that separate but equal, okay? That in other words, as long as, if I have a black bathroom and a white bathroom and they're equal bathrooms, I'm allowed to have separate but equal. Now, Brown versus Board of Ed said, nah, separate but equal is unequal, okay? So that changed that. Now, here we have some key terms. We talked about precedent. That means you establish what the precedent is in a case. Stare decisis. That means that you have to follow. Historical cases. I see someone has something on the chat here. Let me see. Chalas? I don't get it. Okay, so I guess that's an inside joke. Anyhow, so let's move on. Senatorial courtesy means that if you're picking a Supreme Court justice from that person's state, they have the courtesy of ruling in what they think of it. Writ of certiorari, the rule of 4, which we said already, and amicus curiae, the friend of the court. Now, so let's move on. The Warren and Burger Court were very liberal courts. They ruled on Brown versus Board of Ed, which we talked about. The Miranda rights, which basically gives you, they have to read you your rights. So that's very important. We know the Miranda one, and we know that the last 2 Supreme Court justices, Rehnquist and Roberts, are more conservative. However, even though they're more conservative, it is hard to predict because sometimes Justice Roberts, who is a conservative, sometimes he acts like a swing vote. On 2 occasions already, he kept Obamacare legal. And why does the justice do that? Because he says, I don't want to be looked at as a Republican or Democrat. I want to be looked at as someone that's going to be fair. I'm going to keep a non-biased opinion. So in other words, just because someone's a Republican doesn't mean they're going to vote one way or the other. Okay, so we know that presidential appointments and Senate confirmations, we already talked about that last time, so I'm going to skip over that because we got like 13 minutes. Selective incorporation. So the idea is sometimes based on a constitutional amendment, they decide that they're going to try a case, like with the 14th Amendment. Sometimes, so for example, they tried a case because of the due process clause, okay? Sometimes they'll say that things are incorporated. That means that it applies to the states, okay? Like, for example, when they were fighting for gun rights, they said that these rights are incorporated to the state in the Second Amendment, okay? So there are different technical terms that we can use. Either you're saying it's selective, it's very unique, or you're saying it's incorporated to all the states, okay? And we know that the idea of due process goes all the way back to Magna Carta. They probably won't ask you about that, but the idea is that everyone has to follow laws. It goes back to Magna Carta, okay? And again, early examples of incorporation was when they wanted to, the government wanted to seize property. They go, wait a minute, you can't just take property. People have property rights. So they actually heard the case because they're saying when you just take away someone's property without due process, without hearing what they have to say, you are violating their due process rights in the 14th Amendment, okay? Now, there are also cases of what they call non-protected speech. So in other words, on the one hand, the First Amendment says freedom of speech, press, and religion. However, there are cases where they say speech is not protected. So for example, in 1951, if you want to overthrow the government, that's not protected, okay? 1986, in a school has the right to ban lewd speech. In other words, and by the way, people have tried to challenge this over and over again. So in other words, although you have freedom of speech, press, and religion, your freedom of speech ends the minute you walk into a school. It does, okay? And again, there are many cases where they try to challenge us over and over again. And the idea, though, is it has been confirmed that freedom of speech can be limited in schools. Just like the most famous case is Schenck versus U.S. Basically, in Schenck versus U.S., the person was against World War I, so Schenck was encouraging people to not fight in the war. And what they said is, you, sir, are causing a clear and present danger, okay? It's like if someone yells, fire, fire, in a movie theater. That's a clear and present, by the way, that's the case, that's their example that they use, to fire, fire, fire. And the idea is, if they believe that your words, that the words that you speak can cause a clear and present danger, you do not have protected speech. Which is why when someone protests, they must protest peacefully. If you protest in a non-peaceful way, you are causing a clear and present danger. So, moving along, some modern issues. As a result of 9/11, they passed the Patriot Act. The government can tap your phone if they believe that you're suspicious. They can tap your internet. They can seize your voicemail, etc., okay? And a lot of people have challenged this. saying that, that you're violating my right to privacy in the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. However, every time it's been challenged, the U.S. government has won. Okay, and just like there was a case about prior restraint. Can the government stop you from publishing something because you might believe that it will hurt you? And they said you cannot do prior restraint. Who tried to do prior restraint? Richard Nixon. That's why sometimes there are things that the press says that Trump that Trump doesn't want certain things to be said or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. He cannot issue prior restraint. He would have to prove that it's a danger to the country. In other words, he can't just say, I don't like what the Washington Post is saying. If he can prove that what they're saying is dangerous to the country, that's different. But you can't just have prior restraint. And again, that was back from the days of Nixon. Like I said over here, New York Times versus Nixon administration, okay? Now, there are also cases of religion, Everson versus Board of Ed, where it says it prohibits the law that benefits religion. In other words, you must have a separation of state and church. Okay, there was another case, Abington School District versus Champ, where basically you cannot mandate Bible reading in a public school. Okay, there was another case where the school said, well, how about voluntary prayer, like Engel versus Vitale? And they said you cannot have even voluntary prayer. In other words, in a public school, not a private school, there is this idea of separation of state and church. Yes, Joseph.
I don't get what that means. If you just allot an hour of the day for personal or religious time, it's not mandating anybody to pray. It's staying very out of their business.
So
it just
I hear what you're saying, and again, the Supreme Court feels differently than you felt, and these cases have been tried many, many times. I mean, there is a way around. I'm not going to discuss it right now because we only have 7 minutes. And I want to try to finish this review. But the bottom line is the most important case to know, by the way, is the Engel versus Vitale, because you would think that if you're just doing it voluntarily, what's the big deal? But apparently, they said you cannot do it even if participation is not required. Okay. By the way, when they do Pledge of Allegiance in the public schools, if a kid does not want to participate, they have the right to not participate. All right. And a lot of times they call these the lemon test, where they try to figure out if it's violating different things. For example, is it violating race? Is it violating gender? Is it violating anything else? Now, by the way, on the flip side, we had this very famous case called Wisconsin versus Yoder. Okay, basically, in Wisconsin, they wanted to mandate that kids should go to public school through high school, and the Amish said it violates our religion that they should have to go to public school after high school. So, in other words, that's why even in New York State, there are parts of the state that do things a little differently, because again, the idea is that just like the separation of state and church, the state cannot violate your religious beliefs either. And so, in the case of Wisconsin versus Yoder, they basically said, okay, yeah, you're violating their religious beliefs. Okay. Now, public funding for religious institutions, legally, that's only allowed for secular education. They will not fund religion because of separation of state and church. How about vouchers? So vouchers is a creative way where they could have the tax dollars to help fund private schools. So as a result, we do have some vouchers in certain districts and states, but in general, religion in public schools is not allowed. How about religious symbols in public schools? And so it depends how it's done. So for example, obviously, we know that public schools have Santa Claus and things like that. So because it's done in a commercial context, it's allowed. But if it was, blatantly religious, it would not be considered legal. What they're really supposed to do, by the way, when they celebrate Christmas, what they're really supposed to do is they're supposed to celebrate all the holidays, Christmas, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, so forth, so forth. If they're only celebrating one religion, they're actually violating their own rules, by the way, because you're supposed to be, equal footing, if you will. All right, now let's move on. McDonald versus Chicago, very, very important case. This is the case that basically really brought the whole idea about handguns back into the news. Basically, Chicago had a handgun ban, and McDonald basically said, you're violating my Second Amendment right. And basically, because of McDonald versus Chicago, you have a lot of other Supreme Court cases that have expanded gun rights. Why is McDonald versus Chicago so important? Because it's a case that happened in the last 10 years. So there's a good chance they'll ask it. A similar case, McDonald versus Chicago, which set the precedent, to use a word, is District of Columbia versus Heller. The same thing with District of Columbia. They said the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., violated the Second Right Amendment by having a ban on Second Amendments. By the way, we know that because of the McDonald versus Chicago case, District of Columbia versus Heller, there's now a case against New York City, because New York City also bans handguns. And again, if you think about it, the precedent has already been set twice that it's violating the Second Right Amendment, okay? Now, there are other cases as well, like the Morse versus Frederick case, where basically this person wanted to have a sign at a school making reference to marijuana smoking. And long story short, as with all other rulings when it comes to schools, schools have the right to set forth the standards. And therefore, even though the lower court initially said that he had the right to have some sign about marijuana smoking or whatever it was, in the end, they said no. The schools always have the right to set the standards, okay? And by the way, every time they've challenged a school on this, the school has won. And why are they winning? Because they set a precedent, okay? We follow the rule of precedent, okay? And so we've also mentioned that you have the due right process in the 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendment. We know that in the 4th Amendment, that if you want to do a search, we have to know what is probable cause, okay? Very important to understand probable cause. They've challenged us, by the way. So Mapp versus Ohio, they did a warrantless search, and the bottom line is you cannot do a warrantless search, okay? I'm not going to go through every case here because we have like 1 minute left. But for my AP Gov kids that are taking Monday, you definitely want to review all these cases because these cases could come up. I mean, the most important case I would say is Mapp versus Ohio, New Jersey versus LTO, very, very important. The Patriot Act, we already talked about. I would also say that the 2 cases against Rumsfeld because of the Patriot Act are important. Bottom line is you want to know, in these 2 cases, they said the U.S. cannot hold terrorist suspects without habeas corpus rights. And in the next case, they said the U.S. must file Geneva Convention. We already talked about Miranda versus Arizona. Last but not least, you want to know about Gideon versus Wainwright. That's a very, very important case. Very, very famous case that you want to review. And of course, Roe versus Wade, which basically made abortion legal, is also an extremely important case. We already talked about these other cases, so I'm not going to talk about them again. Last case that's very important, Korematsu versus the United States, definitely very important because that basically says that said that it was okay to lock up the Japanese, although we later on reversed that. And of course, be aware of the gay marriage case. There's only one gay marriage case that ever came up. That's Obergefell versus Hodges. The Supreme Court basically said that you cannot ban same-gender marriages in 2015. And by the way, when they ruled again on it in future cases, they filed the precedent again. So that is everything at this point. Have a great day. My U.S. history kids are about to come on. To Yosef and Saul, if you have questions, feel free to email me, and good luck.